All right, so now that we know the basic strategy that we're going to use to convert our application over to full stack, let's create the server for our application. Okay, so what we're going to do for that, we're going to use the same approach that we've used before, and we're going to create a new directory for this. So what I'm going to do is change directories out of our friend tracker application, and I'm just going to create a blank directory called friend tracker server. You can call it friend tracker backend. You can call it something else entirely if you want, but that's what I'm going to call mine. I'm going to say friend tracker server. And this command might be different if you're on Windows. I'm not exactly sure what the Windows command for that is, but if you're confused, just look up make directory in Windows terminal, something like that. Okay, so now that we have that directory, let's actually open it up. Okay, so we're going to go into here. We're going to go into our React folder. Well, that's where I keep all my projects anyway. We're going to open up friend tracker server. And let's start setting up our server, okay? So the first thing we have to do is initialize our directory here as an npm package, and we can do that by saying npm init-y, and that will generate this package.json for us, which will keep track of our dependencies, scripts, etc. So now that we've done that, let's install some other things that we're going to need. The first thing we're going to install is Express, of course. We'll be using this to create our server and all of our endpoints, so let's hit enter, and it will install that for us. And we're not going to install MongoDB yet, because what I usually like to do when converting an application over to full stack is I usually like to start off by just using a fake in-memory database, right? We've seen this earlier. I just find that that helps me write my code in more of a database-independent way if I start off that way. And it's also a lot easier when you don't have to worry about databases up front and all of those operations. So Express should really be the only package we need for the moment. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new folder called source, and this is where we're going to put our server file, which we'll call server.js. And inside here, let's set up a new Express server. But before we do that, I do want to set up Babel as well. Okay, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about what I'm doing here because we've already seen this before. What I'm going to do is just install the Babel core package, the Babel node package, and the Babel preset env package. These will take care of transpiling the code for us. Oh, and I actually want to add save dev on the end of that because those are going to be development dependencies only. And while those are installing, let's actually create our Babel RC file, which will tell Babel how to transpile our code. Inside here, we're just going to need to put presets and have an array and say Babel/preset. And I do go into more detail on this when I show how to set up a basic MERN stack. So if you're not familiar with this, feel free to go check that out. So that's our Babel RC file, and we've installed those Babel packages down here. So the next thing we're going to do is install the node daemon package by saying npm install node daemon save dev. That one's a dev dependency as well. And it will automatically restart our server for us as we make changes, as some of you might remember. Okay, so now that we have those installed, let's actually add a start script to our package.json that we can use to start up our app. I'm going to call this script dev, and some of you might remember this command. We're going to say node daemon --exec babel-node, and then the path to the file that we want to run continuously, which is going to be server.js. So source/server.js. Okay. So that's our script. We'll be able to use that to run our server code once we actually write it. And because we just set up Babel, we'll be able to use import-export syntax as well as async and await. So what we're going to do first of all, we're going to say import express from express. We're going to create our server by saying const app equals express and call that as a function. And we're going to tell our server to listen by saying app.listen. And we're going to tell it to listen on port 8080. And for our callback here, we're going to just log something out to the console that says server is listening on port 8080. All right, and that is all the server code that we need in order to actually have our server running. But in order to make it do actual interesting things, what we're going to do is copy over our fake data from the front end and put it inside this server.js file for the time being. So let's open up our front end. I opened the back end in that IDE window, so let me just reopen that again. Okay, so we're going to open up our friend tracker here. We're going to find that data file that we had, so let's open that up. And this contains the friends data as well as the profile data. We're going to just copy this over, copy it, and we'll put it directly inside the server file. Actually, why don't we create a new file for this? That's going to get kind of cluttery, I think. So we'll create a new file inside here. We'll call it fake database.js. All right. And inside here, of course, we'll say export. And let's change these to let so we can actually change them. All right, so we're going to say export let, and we'll change this to profile data. And we'll say export let, and we'll change this just to friends. Okay, this is going to kind of mimic our setup when we actually add a database to our server. And the last thing we need to add to this file is an array that will keep track of the favorite IDs. Okay, so basically the front end is going to be loading all of its data from our server. So let's say export let favorites, and this is just going to start off as an empty array. All right, so we have our favorites, our friends, and our profile data. Let's go back into our server now, and we're just going to import those. We'll use them later as we actually implement each of our endpoints. So we'll say import profile data, friends, and favorites from fake database. And one last thing we're going to do, because we are going to be making post requests, we will need to actually get the payload, right, the request body from those. So we need to tell Express to expect that by saying app.use express.json. All right, that just parses the body of any incoming requests and adds it to the request argument in the callback. And that should be all the setup we need to do for our server. So let's run npm run dev and make sure everything runs smoothly. And sure enough, we see that it says server is listening on port 8080. If you really want to test and make sure that you have everything set up correctly, you can always add a very simple endpoint here, like /test and request response, and you can just send back something like response.send hello from Express. All right, and we should be able to test that now by opening up a browser and going to localhost 8080/test. And we should see hello from Express returned from our server. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.